So I'd like to call this session to order. Turns out the microphone will pop out of the stand if you touch it. Chris, you can hear us well back there.
I can hear you forward.
I understand what you mean.
Not loud enough. I'm not sure if I can hear it.
Luckily we can't hear Tris, but we need to get relatively serious now. Our speaker in this session is... Can't hear? Okay.
Be loud like a lawyer should be.
Oh, I can do that, but I just didn't want to have to make Russ shout. You still can't hear? Okay. I need to appoint someone as a legate. Joe, can you see if you can talk to the folks about getting a sound in here? If anyone's real good at electricity, let me know. Sounds like it's on.
It's on.
All right, we're going to assume you can hear me, and if you can't, that's your problem. Okay? Is that all right? Usually these are hypersensitive, but I'll try again. Our speaker this afternoon is Professor Russ Hittinger from the University of Tulsa. He has the good fortune to be a graduate of Notre Dame back in the glory days of the mid-'70s. Hey. It's true, the era of Ara. He then pursued a PhD and actually caught one at St. Louis University. Went on to teach at several fine institutions, among them Catholic University and Fordham, and recently was drafted by Tulsa to be their chair of Catholic studies. And while not chairing Catholic studies, he is a research professor in their law school. Russ has, as you might imagine, published quite widely. The work of his I know best is work on natural law theory, and then a rather high visibility project involving Roe v. Wade and its effect on the legitimacy of the regime, as I believe the work was entitled. Today he is speaking on Centesimus Annus 10 years later. If any of us were good in Latin, we could say 110 years later, but I think none of us can. And just to make sure that there's balance in the title, the rest of it is John Paul II and the Munus Regale. Some of you don't know what a Munus is, but you're about to learn. Here's Russ Hittinger.
As for the glory years of Parsegian, I never thought I would teach at a university that could beat Notre Dame in football. Let's see. This last May 1st, we marked the 10th anniversary of Centesimus Annus. Clear? Okay. Its importance for the social doctrine of the Catholic Church can be gathered from the fact that in the New Catechism, we find it quoted or cited 37 times, more than any other pontifical document in history. Everyone here will already know that Centesimus Annus was written to celebrate two events. First, to mark the centenary of Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, 1891. Remarkably, Leo XIII wrote 110 encyclicals and another, approximately 60 of which dealt with the problem of the state and social order. But subsequent papal, the calendar has been set to Rerum Novarum, so that at every 25-year interval since 1891, the reigning pope has had something to say about Rerum Novarum. Second, the Pope presents Centesimus Annus as a rereading, a reinterpretation of the Church's social doctrine in reference to the events of 1989. That series of bloodless revolutions which began in Poland and swept through Central and Eastern Europe. These events represent a closing chapter in the long history of the modern state. Approximately, we can mark this history from about the time when Wojtyła was born in 1920, just after World War I. For all practical purposes, that war destroyed the last vestiges of Christian kingship. In 1918, the Habsburgs in Austria, the Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollerns in Prussia, and the Wittelsbachs in Bavaria ceased to exist. So Karl Joseph Wojtyła was born into a Central Europe whose fate was not to be decided by families and princes who still had something of the odor of Christian kingship. But 1989 can be seen in a much longer history. In 1500 AD, there were about 500 independent political entities in Europe. When Rerum Novarum was written in 1891, there were only 25. A millennium of king-making, which rendered every person in Europe subject to some prince, had given way to state-making. There is, of course, a vast literature on what makes a polity a state-making regime, but I suppose that everyone would agree that state-making regimes are marked by the following criteria, among others. First, territoriality rather than nationality or religion. Second, systematic taxation. Third, the transformation of the culture of courts into a professional body of civil servants. Fourth, monopoly over lethal force with the creation of standing armies and internal police forces. Fifth, and perhaps most important, monopoly over education, which is probably the most single important instrument of state-making, is monopoly on education. Sixth, and finally, what everyone takes to be the main characteristic of a state-making regime, and that's sovereignty. More or less as Jean Bodin defined it in 1576, absolute, perpetual, indivisible power. When we think of modern man, we think of the Enlightenment, the sovereignty of reason, ideologies of liberty. We think especially of his technologies. But his greatest and most sustained work was the creation of the state. If we ask a modern man who or what is sovereign, he would not say reason, the individual, or science. Rather, he would say without hesitation, the state. It is, as it were, a self-evident proposition. Sovereignty is the state. History testifies that the peoples of Europe and her former colonies were prepared to make almost any sacrifice to transform their polities into states. The task of state-making overshadowed any particular class or ideology. Even Italians had to find a state. For heaven's sakes, Marxists, dedicated to the withering away of the state, had to have a state. And by the mid-20th century, the results were catastrophic. Here I cite statistics from a very interesting book by R.J. Rummel entitled Death by Government. World War I saw 9 million people killed in battle, surpassed just a few years after that by 15 million battle deaths in World War II. The total death count in the international and domestic wars, revolutions, violent conflicts of the 20th century is about 36 million. And if we add to this figure the number of non-battle deaths, about 360 million men, women, children have been shot, beaten, tortured, knifed, burned, starved, frozen, crushed, worked to death, buried alive, drowned, hanged, and bombed. And this does not even begin to estimate all of the other non-lethal uses of force by modern states over individuals, associations, churches, and economic activity. When Leo XIII wrote his encyclicals, modern states were in the full flush of their power. They knew nothing yet of the trenches of Verdun or of the totalitarian regimes that would follow on the heels of the Great War. Elected Pope in 1978, exactly 1 century after Leo XIII, John Paul, of course, came from Poland, the only major European nation that did not have its own state except for a brief period after World War I. It's all the more interesting, then, that it was a Polish Pope who set out to interpret this history culminating in 1989. Having read Centesimus Annus many times over the past decade, Eventually, I found myself asking the question, why did it take him 13 years to write an encyclical on the state? This is not such an odd question if we consider the fact that the inaugural encyclical of every pope of the modern period dealt with the problem of the modern state. Let me put the historical situation in exact numbers. From 1800, the election of Pope Pius VII, until 1978, when John Paul II was elected, there were 13 popes who issued 267 encyclicals, 120 of which dealt with the problem of the state. The papacy was preoccupied with this issue, so much so that the term social doctrine of the church is in a way a misnomer, for the issue of economic markets in society was treated primarily in references to the pathologies of the political order. Now, had John Paul II followed the precedent of his predecessors, his first encyclical would have addressed the political situation in Poland. Surely a pope from the most politically fraught sector of Europe would have something to say right away about the communist oppression of some 50 million Catholics behind the Iron Curtain. Instead, he issued Redemptor Hominis, not on the problem of the state, but rather on Jesus Christ as Salvator Hominis, the Savior of man. It is the first inaugural encyclical in more than 2 centuries that does not make the state one of its major themes. Where his predecessors asked the question, quid est Caesar? What is Caesar? Redemptor Hominis begins with the question posed by Psalm 8. I quote, what is man, quid est homo, that you should be mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you should take care for him? You have made him a little less than the angels and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him rule over the works of your hands. Unquote. To the question, what is man? The Pope answers, participated royalty. Indeed, in his first trip to Poland after being elected Pope, a trip that would forever change the history of Central Europe, he called the Poles piasts, sovereigns, or those who are crowned. So too in his trip to Cameroon, he referred to the African youth as being crowned according to Psalm 8, verses 4 to 6. Now, as I understand it, the chief question of political theology is this. In the light of divine revelation, what is man and what is he entitled to rule? And so today I'd like to discuss with you how John Paul II endeavored to move this question from the state to its original location in theological anthropology. This orientation was perhaps already evident in his decision after becoming Pope to retain the coat of arms he had borne as Archbishop of Krakow. Incidentally, the prefect of the papal household in 1978, Monsignor Jacques Martin, later reported that John Paul II was under a great deal of pressure to adopt a conventional coat of arms. But he kept his Krakowian coat of arms. Completely missing are the typical symbols of his predecessors, the fleur-de-lis, the castles, the stars, the shooting comets, the eagles, all of which represent princely, familial, in any case, human symbols of authority to rule. In their place, we find a blue shield with a slightly off-centered gold Latin cross, and under this cross is the letter M for Mary, who represents the church at the foot of the cross. In answer to the question, quid est homo, the armorial shield answers, ecce homo, behold the man. Now, Redemptor Hominis is the first of a trilogy of encyclicals on the Divine Trinity. In each, the Pope makes exactly the same move. What does it mean to rule is turned back to the question, what is man? And the anthropological question is developed in the light of things revealed by the Son, about the Father, and through the Spirit. And here I summarize. In Redemptor Homines, he proposes to discern the signs of the times. The most important signs, he contends, are not the works of modern man, the organization of the state, science, technology, economic markets. Rather, the most important sign of the times is man in flight from himself, in flight from the very works of his own dominion. And here I quote, "This gives rise to a question. Why is it that the power given to man from the beginning, by which he was to subdue the earth, turns against himself?" Unquote. The Pope sets out to answer this question first in Genesis, and then in the light of Christ, the new Adam, the image of the invisible God, who reveals the Father to man and man to himself. In Dives and Misericordia, 1980, on the Father, the Pope discusses God's rule made visible in the creature. How is the invisible made known? Is the main question. And just as in Redemptor Homines, the Pope studies the question by going back to Genesis to see how human dominion makes visible the rule of the Father, and then ahead to the Gospels to expound the relationship between justice and mercy in divine rule. In the course of this, he makes two very interesting points, and again, only to summarize. First, that desacralization in modern times is always an attack upon or a forgetting of the invisible made visible, chiefly man himself. And second, that justice without mercy cannot restore man to himself. Thus, man imitates divine rule not only by making judgments concerning justice, saying who owes what to whom, but also by being rich in mercy. The sign of divine rule, he argues, is mercy and humility. Finally, in Dominus et Vivificatem in 1986, he comments on a line from Gaudium et Spes, quote, "When God is forgotten, the creature becomes unintelligible," unquote. And among the things that become unintelligible, he contends, is ruling and being ruled, this entire phenomenon. Now, I find it very interesting that in these encyclicals and other teaching documents between 1978 and 1991, John Paul develops the theme of ruling and being ruled in light of two key sections of Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church issued in 1964. The first is Lumen Gentium 36, where the Council Fathers speak of Christ constituting his disciples in a royal freedom, and teaching them that what it means to enjoy the virtue or the property of ruling, the Latin here is regalitas, usually translated being a king. And here Lumen Gentium asserts that Revelation teaches to have regalitas is to serve. To serve is to reign. The first and final word of Scripture on ruling power is that whoever rules must serve rather than being served. The second is Lumen Gentium number 31, where the laity are said to participate in the priestly, prophetic, and kingly office of Christ. This teaching on the Munera Christi is discussed in almost every teaching document of this pontificate. Indeed, John Paul calls it a ratio novitatis, the novel element in the teachings of Vatican II. And later, when he issued in 1983, promulgated the new Code of Canon Law, he said, "In wake of the Second Vatican Council and at the beginning of my pastoral ministry, my aim was to emphasize forcefully the priestly, prophetic, and kingly dignity of the entire people of God," unquote. Intrigued by this constant use, or the repeated use of the word Munus in the documents of Vatican II, my friend Janet Smith discovered that the word was used at least 248 times by the Council. Now, the word Munus is usually, but I think badly, translated into English as function. Living as we do in an age of machines and biological reductionism, the word function is apt to conjure exactly the wrong meaning. So let me say a few things about the meaning of this Latin word. In pre-Christian Rome, If you'd said to someone in the 1st century AD that you were going to a Munus, it meant the ancient Etruscan ritual of serving the dead by shedding blood on or in the near vicinity of ancestral graves. This is the origin of the gladiatorial contest. The gladiatorial contest was never called a ludus, a game. It was always called a munus. It was a religious service. In other contexts, it signified a duty or a gift of service. That's where we get the word munificent from. Bountiful, from the word munus, for gift of service. Not to be confused with the Latin word donatio, which signifies the disposal of property. Hence, the word community, communitas, derives etymologically from the word munus, people bound together by the sharing of gifts and services, not by the transfer of property. The word munus is frequently used in the Vulgate translation of the Scripture, repeatedly, for example, to give the corresponding Latin word for the various aspects of Jewish ritual. Then in the New Testament, in Mark 2:11, for example, the Magi are said to be giving munera to the child in Bethlehem. Same for the widow's mite in Luke 21:1. And the sacrifice of the high priest in the epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 8, speaks of the munera of the high priest. In time, Christian theologians would speak of the triplex munus Christi, priest, prophet, and king. During the pontificate of Pius XI, 1922 to 39, individuals, families, corporations, churches, even the state itself, as well as international authorities, were said to be bearers not only of jura, of rights, but also of munera, of having roles to play, gifts to give. In the deepest sense, human rights are exemplified in munera, whether natural or supernatural. In the encyclicals of Pius XI, the concept of subsidiarity is elucidated first in the idea of a plurality of munera, and only secondarily in the juridical terms of rights. Thus, the notion of munus in modern papal thought unifies two things that are so often split apart by the modern political and social thought. First, what man claims as his own, his rights, and second, what man has as a gift of service, his munus. It's a very important point. Beginning with Pius XI, through John Paul II, rights are not derived from human nature abstractly considered, but rather from human nature as already bearing, implicitly or explicitly, social munera. On this view, rights flow from antecedent munera, gifts, duties, vocations, missions. Hence, it is quite different than the idea of the right as an immunity. For what is an immunity etymologically? An immunitas, the absence of munera. I might add that this is one of the reasons commentators have had such problems understanding the term social justice, because for Pius XI and his successors, social justice is nothing other than the manifold organicity of the common good, or to put it in a slightly different way, it is the demand that the common good be brought about through organizations, institutions, and groups. According to Pius XI, social justice ensues, I quote, when each individual member is given what it needs for the exercise of its proper function, all that is necessary for the exercise of his social munus, unquote. Social justice, therefore, should not be confused with distributive justice. On the assumption that men and women already have munera, indeed that they already perform acts which redound to the common good, the role of the political community is facilitative. It's never the role of the political community to distribute the munera. Subsidiarity, therefore, is a principle derivative from social justice, namely that when subsidium or help be given either by the parts to the whole or the whole to the parts, the plurality of functions or munera should never be destroyed or absorbed. As I understand it, this is why Pius XI and Pius XII began to apply the idea of munera beyond their original meaning in theology and ecclesiology to the social order. It's worth noting that in some 30 encyclicals of Pius XI, the word jus, or right, is used more than 400 times. In 93% of the time, the word is attributed to an authority or to a source of responsibility, to munera, other than the state. Furthermore, when a pius attributes a right to the state, it is almost always connected to the responsibility of the state to recognize and protect prior responsibilities, munera, of the family, spouses, children, of God, the church, local ecclesiastical authority, seminary, schools, charitable organizations, property, labor, and all manner of associations. But what organizes this ever-accumulating list of rights are the munera, which provide the teleological and social framework for the juridical conception of rights. Now, the Vatican Council carefully consolidated Pius XI's social doctrine by highlighting the perfectionistic rather than the merely negative conception of rights. And we find the word munus used in two important ways. Back to Lumen Gentium. In the note of explication appended to Lumen Gentium, the word munera is used to explain the interrelation of ruling powers within the church. Quote, "It is a question of munera which have to be exercised by a plurality of subjects cooperating hierarchically by the will of Christ," unquote. A communion of diverse agents having services to render to the whole body. And Cardinal Felici explains in this note of explication that munus is a better word than potestas, power, because without the munera, the powers would appear aimless, non-participatory, unilateral, inorganic, anonymous. One might say precisely those characteristics of the modern state which have proved so troubling over the last 400 years. After treating the initiation of the laity by baptism into the threefold Munus Christi, Lumen Gentium then says that the munus of the laity, quoting Ephesians 6:12, is to wrestle against the cosmocrats of this dark age and against the spiritual forces of wickedness, unquote. It goes on to explain that this participated royalty of the laity is expressed at first in the conquering of the reign of sin in themselves, and second by serving Christ and their fellow men, that they may by humility and patience lead all men into the kingdom. Now, as I said, John Paul II calls the development of this concept of the munera, the element of novelty in the work of the Vatican Council, and pledged to devote his entire pastoral ministry to giving it the emphasis it deserves. In his first encyclical, for example, he proposes that human dignity has to be rediscovered as kingship, regalitas, a notion, he adds, that's linked to every sphere of Christian and human morality. This munus regale, he continues, has three characteristics. First, in the person, regalitas means the act of self-mastery perfected by the virtues. In the world, regalitas means the act of dominion over physical things, signifying the priority of spirit over matter. So in Laborem Exercens, 1981, he treats the problem of human labor in the light of the triplex Munus Christi, sorting out how dominion relates to ruling oneself and to ruling others. Third, in the social world, regalitas is expressed in acts of service, according to Matthew 20:28, serving rather than being served. In his biography of the Pope, George Weigel discusses this as the principle of the law of the gift. In 1979, he began a 5-year cycle of audiences on theology of the body. The following sentence from the February 20, 1980 conference summarizes the main thesis of this cycle of conferences. The body, in fact, and only it, is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and the divine. It was created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden from eternity in God, and thus to be its sign, unquote. To understand man, it's necessary to enter into the mystery of this signum, this sign, the human body, which is imago Dei, and which at the very beginning discloses what the Pope calls a nuptial relationship. So here in Genesis, according to the Pope, we find the original meaning of participated royalty. Divine rule is made visible first in the dominion over things of the earth, second in mastery over one's own body, and third in reciprocal rule over one another's bodies. So, the first sign of the social Munus Regale is not the state, but rather what the Pope calls the proto-sacramental institution of matrimony. He goes on to observe, however, that something new is introduced at Genesis 3:16. He shall rule over you. As the Pope puts it, in the state of lapsed nature, Adam and Eve seem to be driven back to another level. With sin, the first note of regalitas, which is self-mastery, begins to look like the act of dominion originally exercised over physical things rather than the rule of persons. So in Mulieris Dignitate, in 1988, he continues this line of inquiry into the difference between ruling things and ruling persons. Returning to Genesis 3:16, he proposes, quote, this domination indicates the disturbance and loss of the stability of that fundamental equality which the man and the woman possess in the unity of two. Thus, in Genesis 3:16 must be compared with 1 Corinthians 7, for the wife does not rule over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not rule over his own body, but the wife does, unquote. Christ then reveals the royal dignity of service by teaching that to serve is to reign. Assuming in his own person the humanity that is the inheritance of Adam, Christ decisively answers the question posed in Psalm 8, quod est homo. He fully reveals man to himself, among other ways, by restoring the institution of matrimony, relocating it in the rule of persons rather than dominion over things. In Redemptoris Mater, 1987, the notion of participated royalty is developed in the context of Mariology. The Magnificat, he observes, exemplifies the correct understanding of ruling power. To serve is to reign. In this way, Mary obtained the state of royal liberty, libertas regalis, proper to all of Christ's disciples. It's worth noting that at this very time, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith issued 2 instructions on liberation theology. Cardinal Ratzinger writes that although the Magnificat has political implications, it should not be read as a teaching about the distribution of power. In the 1986 instruction, he argues that what's truly new in the gospel is not the praxeological or the political issue of redistributing power, even if it be for worthy ends. Rather, the gospel discloses a new stance toward power from the very start. Explicating the teaching of the Council and of the Pope on participated royalty, Ratzinger insists that the Munus Regale requires the royal freedom of self-mastery and service to others. So, we have seen that terms suggestive of political order, coronation, according to Psalm 8, dominion, mastery, ruling, kingship, have been used by this Pope to understand quite an array of subjects. The relation between body and soul, dominion over things, human labor, marriage, Mariology, Christian discipleship, even liberation theology. But it might be asked, what has any of this to do with political order as we ordinarily see it? In the Apostolic Exhortation Familiaris Consortio, subtitled On the Munera of the Christian Family, the Pope says that although the kingly mission is not to be reduced to politics, its proper and unique vocation of the laity includes what he calls the Munus sociale et politicum, social and political Munus. This exhortation was issued on the Feast of Christ the King. The preface to that feast, by the way, is quoted at Lumen Gentium 36, where we also find this formula, to serve is to reign, this used so often by John Paul II. And here in Familiaris Consortio, he quotes it again. The laity are to order temporal things according to the kingdom of God. The term here, the laity, are to inscribe the divine law in the life of the earthly city. Now, from what I can tell, the Pope is not especially interested in political constitutions, political parties, or any kind of specific legislative agenda. Rather, he seems to have 2 points in mind. First, that this munus politicum is properly the service of the laity, not priests. Second, whether or not the world understands it, political power finds its norm in kingship, not necessarily in the constitutional office of the king, but at least in regalitas, that virtue of which is serving rather than being served. This is a virtue deeper than the issue of particular forms of government. Indeed, the Pope contends that this service is the fundamental element in the exercise of political power, howsoever that power be constitutionally configured or distributed. These thoughts are made even more clear in Christi Fidelis, 1988. Very important passage. The Pope writes, "A new aspect to the grace and dignity coming from baptism is here introduced. The lay faithful participate for their part in the threefold munus of Christ, priest, prophet, and king. This aspect has never been forgotten in the living tradition of the Church, as exemplified in the explanation that St. Augustine offers on Psalm 26. And here follows the quote from Augustine. Quote, "David was anointed king. In those days, only a king and a priest were anointed. These two persons prefigured the one and only priest and king who was to come, Christ, for the name Christ means anointed. Not only has our head been anointed, but we, his body, have also been anointed. Therefore, anointing comes to all Christians, even though the Old Testament, in its times, restricted it to only two persons. Clearly, we are the body of Christ because we are all anointed, and in him are Christs, that is, anointed ones, as well as Christ himself, the anointed one." Unquote. Now, in the Middle Ages, this venerable image of bride and bridegroom, Christ in the church, was diverted from its proper and original context in the sacrament of baptism, and was made to define the relations between the prince and his state. The king was given a ring to signify his solemn marriage to the realm. As James I said, "What God hath joined together, let no man separate. I am the husband, and the whole island of England is my lawful wife. I am the head, and this is my body. I am the shepherd, and it is my flock." Unquote. In France, the coronation rite included the ritual of the sleeping king. On the morning of the coronation, the prelates of the realm knocked at the door of the king, who pretended to be asleep. The king, awakening from his fictitious sleep, agreed to marry the realm. The significance of the ritual is debated. Perhaps like Adam put into a deep sleep before his betrothal to Eve in Genesis 2, or like the bride in the Song of Songs, "I was sleeping, but my heart kept vigil." The King of France awoke and proceeded into the cathedral to marry his realm. The last ritual of the sleeping king was 1775, Louis XVI. Before the age of absolutism, the office of the king exemplified the sanctified laity. These coronation rituals, properly understood, represented the dignities bestowed on every Christian at the time of his or her baptism. Interestingly, in his panegyric to Constantine, really the first important Christian statement on sanctified kingship, Eusebius of Caesarea contended that when Genesis teaches that man was made in the image and likeness of God, it should be inferred, Eusebius teaches, that God made Adam and Eve not a political animal, but basilikon zoon, a royal or kingly animal. And therefore the restoration of the imago Dei through Christ is not a work exclusively given to the person of Constantine. Rather, Constantine represents the person of all baptized Christians. Though it never entirely lost, the Munus Regale of the laity had been terribly displaced before the French Revolution destroyed the office of anointed kings. In early modernity, political Christendom had devolved into an Old Testament model of two anointed rulers. And as the Pope remarks then, although the Munus Regale of the laity was never entirely forgotten, it was eclipsed for all practical purposes by the monarchs and their courts, who jealously guarded what they deemed an exclusive title to the kingly predicate. From a theological point of view, political modernity did not fix the problem because it did not restore the status of regalitas to the people. Modern regimes might accommodate the anointing of priests so long as the Munus Regale of the priest is confined to a merely private or a merely spiritual sphere. But for their part, the baptized laity in modern times and in modern regimes are considered citizens whose chief responsibility is to legitimate political power. As a people, however, they reign without ruling. They have abstract power, but no Munus Regale. Thus, the theological anthropology of participated royalty seems, to modern people, irrelevant to citizenship. And isn't this exactly why John Paul II, in his 1979 trip to Poland, called his fellow Poles Piasts? Therefore, it was necessary to recover the predicates of kingly dignity. And as I see it, this is precisely what John Paul II was trying to do in those 13 years before he issued an encyclical on the state. He had to do so very carefully. In the first place, it was not an idea familiar to the laity. In the second place, it was apt to be confused with other things. The vocation of the anointed laity might be confused with an anointed political party or a liberationist program that anoints a particular class of people. Or what was even more likely in the West, the Munus Regale might be taken merely as another way of talking about popular sovereignty. In our time, the constitutional forms of regimes is not a pressing question, at least not in principle. In the Western world, almost everyone agrees that political authority ought to be constitutionally limited, directed to the protection of human rights. There are important disagreements about particulars, but not about the basic picture. In the Catholic world, debate about forms of regimes was very vigorous, of course, in those decades after the French Revolution, particularly in France, where monarchists and republicans regarded this dispute as a kind of blood sport. The debate in France, however, was completely exhausted by the time of World War I. With the rise of the totalitarian regimes after that war, the papacy and Catholics generally held the same position as everyone else in the West, namely that the constitutional form of government must resist totalitarianism, and in practice, this meant some form of constitutional democracy. In his Christmas radio addresses of 1942 and 1944, Pope Pius XII put the Church squarely behind constitutional democracy, and with the exception of the liberation theologians of the 1960s, there has been no significant controversy in the Catholic world over the forms of regimes. Rather, the deeper problem, or the problem stood at a deeper level. Not the existence of political liberty, but its meaning and its use in the light of theological anthropology. Here the soil was and is very shallow, and it was here that John Paul had to begin his teaching. So, by way of conclusion, I want to make 3 points. First, John Paul II continued the work of Pius XI, Pius XII, and the Vatican Council in contending that ruling is better understood as a munus than as a potestas, a gift rather than a power. The most important thing in the visible world is not the state. Some Enlightenment theorists perhaps wanted to say this, but they didn't know how. For on the Enlightenment scenario of the state of nature, which always was meant to be an alternative to Genesis, on these scenarios, man was disclosed in his rights, but never in his munera. The Enlightenment state of nature gave back to European humanity its jura, but never its regalitas. Second, the Catholic response to the modern conception of the natural man as a bearer of rights who becomes a citizen without any kingly predicates was, of course, at first, immediately after the Revolution, to try to reemphasize the rightful prerogatives, the munera of Christian princes. The munus politicum of the laity, therefore, was slow to develop, among other reasons because it seemed too close to the problem were the positions of the anti-clerical laicist states who tried to subordinate the church to the state. But it did emerge in the teachings of Pius XI, and John Paul II correctly perceived its importance. For the chief problem of our time is not teaching Catholics how to be citizens of constitutional democracies. You only have to turn on television to learn it. Rather, Catholics had to be taught how to recover their baptismal dignity as kings. Third, John Paul II was trying to correct, I gather, a tendency among Catholics to view the Church's social doctrine as a set of prescriptions about political and economic policies, prescriptions and analyses related only extraneously to theology. So in Solicitudo Rei Socialis and in Centesimus Annus, John Paul II emphasizes over and over again that social doctrine is theology. So in Centesimus Annus he writes, as such, the Church's social doctrine proclaims God and his mystery of salvation in Christ to every human being, and for that very reason reveals man to himself. In this light, and only in this light, italics in the original, does it concern itself with everything else: the human rights of the individual, the working class, family, education, duties of the state, ordering of national, international society, economic life, culture, war and peace, and respect for life, unquote. We might say that the Pope was trying to head off a misreading of the signs of the times. Not so much the external organization of human liberty, constitutions, markets, applied sciences, but the flight of man from himself, the possibility that man can fashion adequate solutions to the external order of liberty, even while evacuating that liberty of any anthropological density, getting nowhere close to the Munus Regale. This is exactly what he was trying to explain, I propose, to the recently liberated peoples of Central and Eastern Europe in 1989. And so I brought you now to the cusp of Centesimus Annus, John Paul's great encyclical on the state and the social order. And I'm going to leave you right there. Thank you. John.
In one of my incarnations, I work as a lawyer, and I want to take your notion of munus and just run it by you as American lawyers think of it. So think of the right of a married couple to raise their children, or a married person to raise his or her children. In your language, I think that's a munus which the state is to facilitate and not preempt. Think, secondly, of the right of a teacher to teach, or for that matter, a scholar to engage in research. That, in your conception, is a Munus. And now think, this is weaker constitutionally, think of the right of a preacher to preach. Again, as I understand it, that would be a Munus.
It would be the Munus prophetic.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, yeah. Now, the odd thing is, the interesting thing is that in American constitutional law, as you know, these are all rights. They're either First Amendment rights or 14th Amendment substantive due process rights. And they're asserted and they're deployed quite effectively. So we have whole courses in these things. Now, your claim, as I understand it, is that there's something really lost, irretrievably almost, if we think of parental responsibility, parental prerogatives, and so on, as mere rights. What we need to do, you're saying, if I have you right, is to think of those rights, those sort of political entities, as having a ground, a basis in this antecedent, this prior social reality. And now, okay, I'm almost to a question here, but remember, I'm in charge. But there's something funny about these munera, and it makes them. It makes their translation so difficult. Because on the one hand, I have a responsibility. I can go to jail if I don't support my kids and so on. It's a duty. It's onerous. On the other hand, it's a gift. It's a freedom of mine. I mean, there's a peculiarity about this language you're bringing us, that as soon as you try to translate it into American or Anglo-American judicial talk, it suddenly loses half of its reality. My rights are good things that I possess, and you better not take away from me. My munera are mixed things. They're simultaneously obligations that I might want to slough off, and then sort of constitutive, I don't know what the right word is, freedoms that I might want to protect. Now I want you to shed some light on that.
That's right. One of the problems, of course, as I understand Pius XI, who is really the guy responsible for, I would say, this revolution in language. By the way, Leo XIII always used the expression jura et officia, so rights and offices or duties. And that language, although it doesn't entirely disappear under Pius XI, gets jura et munera. And it happens so often, so repeatedly, that this is not a mistake. I mean, he knows exactly why he's putting the word munera in where officia used to do. This is my suspicion. They don't drop the language of rights. Jura are still there. I think the term offices did not sound sufficiently dynamic and teleological enough. And by the 1920s and 1930s, it was clear that they needed a more dynamical term in there to show, look, it's not just that families, corporations, priests, monks, have a right of immunity as against the state. By the way, I find in none of these documents a criticism of the notion of immunity itself, because that's the way it's going to turn out legally. I have an immunity does not imply I have no munera. What it implies in a legal sense is that I don't have one to you, let's say. Rather, I have one to something else. Now, that language on its own is perfectly fine for juridical purposes. But of course, what it's not bringing into the picture is the munera underneath it. And so what can happen is that the language of rights, because of its negative cast juridically, can make it look as though our rights are without teleology, they're socially contextless, and they somehow arise as some sort of immunity you have just by virtue of having your birthday suit. So Pius XI is wanting to put that word back in, not to cancel out the meaning of rights. Because actually the first long lists of rights in papal encyclicals begin under P11. I incidentally also want to mention this. The longest list of rights in a 20th century encyclical is Pacem in Terris. And if you look carefully, they're always summarized as munera. I mean, Pacem in Terris is not just giving you a list of rights. He gives you the list of rights, and then a discussion of, as it were, where they come from and what they're headed toward, which is their social munera. So the legal language is fine. It just needs to be complicated or complemented with something else. I believe that the concept of social justice, which I just had to kind of hit and run on here in this paper, is impossible to understand without munera or something like it. Because social justice is not distributive justice. Social justice is the idea that there are already in play social responsibilities, munera, if you will, and that the state never distributes those to you, and that it's either to get out of the way or to assist without absorbing. Once you lose the concept of the munera, social justice will appear to be either legal or distributive justice just on the basis of rights. And the concept gets lost. Yes, Father.
Yeah, just two quick questions, Russ. One, in the development of this recovery of the Munus Regale, what relationship does this doctrine, this development, especially in John Paul's work, stand in something else that is dear to John Paul, and that is religious freedom? You know, he also quotes, first he had a hand in shaping as Archbishop of Krakow, and then he quotes it very often, the notion that our dignity as wayfarers has to be protected by that vocation.
The word crops up in Dignitatis Humanae. I mean, even conscience has a munus.
Okay,
and
so
the things I see John here, in the conferences on the body, even the body is said to have a munus. What's the munus of the body for JP2? It's to make the invisible visible. So this word gets connected to almost a bewildering array of things in JP2.
So this call to recover for the Christians in their baptism, married couples as the primary locus of that primary culture, the kingship aspect of that, how does that stand in relationship to religious freedom? So that's one question. Second question is just give you an opportunity to talk on something that we've talked about before, is that once you start to make the social teaching of the church is emphasizing the sacral vocation of the family and no longer describing the state in sacral terms, what happens, and it starts talking about the state as a useful good, well, then what happens to the administration of justice, and what is the state actually doing? So those two questions.
Well, I suppose Western people have lost memory of, for many centuries now, the Munus Regale. This was not due to the modern state, by the way. I think the monarchs and their courts were probably the first who were responsible for claiming that only the anointed king has the Munus Regale, even though clearly the anointed king got it in Christian theology originally because of the theology of baptism. Okay. So we have lost living memory of the notion that we're not just, as Aristotle says, political animals, but kingly animals. And having lost that sensibility, we are kind of used to just falling back on being citizens. We're just citizens. I think John Paul II was absolutely right to diagnose that problem. In fact, I have never seen it diagnosed anywhere better than his. It's not surprising that it comes out of Poland, where people retain their dignity as piasts because of their own problems with the career of modern states. What would happen if John Paul II and others like him were successful in moving the language of ruling and being ruled from our fixation on it with the state back to this kind of anthropology of man himself being a participated royalty? And what if we were to see that and really work it out, both philosophically, theologically, and practically? What kind of government would we want? We can only guess. We wouldn't want a modern state. Is that imminent? No. Because John Paul II is working with very rough material here. He's working with us. And our grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, we've all been citizens. No one would think, except in purely metaphorical terms, of being a king. You remember the show from the 1950s, Queen for a Day, where the woman would receive the scepter and the cloak of authority if she could buy a certain amount of merchandise within a 20-minute period. You see, Queen for a Day. Now, this memory has been lost, so John Paul II, the Vatican Council, and I think we've got to go back to Pius XI. If this were really worked out in a successful kind of political theology, I suspect that the people would want to describe political authority of the state much differently than they do today. What that would look like, I don't know, because it's not at hand, as far as I can see. That doesn't answer your question about our religious liberty, but it does your second one. It's trying to take a stab at your second question. Tris.
Now, I enjoyed the presentation very much, and I am going to be so unkind as to try to suggest some subtext behind your text and that of John Paul's text. And the suggestion is one that you already adverted to, the puzzlement in the West about how to think about polity and society after the French Revolution. And the suggestion that maybe the use of Munus Regale may be much more revolutionary than either you or John Paul recognize. Because to see the full harvest of the French Revolution is to realize we've been returned to a pre-Constantinian, now anti-Christian polity and society. And so to think of us as having Munus Regale, to be the king and the queen, is to set us over against the Rawlsian notion of being citizens as citizens of faith, which have their only meaning in a very thickly and indeed anti-Christian notion of justice. So it's really, one way to read it is John Paul II out against Rawls. Because if you would think, it struck me, maybe the subtext is how absolutely unchristian social justice becomes once you have a post-Christian state. Because of all of education, all of welfare, all of healthcare is absolutely designed to do away with Christianity. So the only hope is to just absolutely oppose all Christians, any whiff of political social justice, because it's always going to be anti-Christian. And therefore, you would want to talk not about citizens, but of kings and queens who would have to stand against a very evil polity, much like what was there before Constantine came. So I wonder if it's this, in the way you talked about issues, you weren't actually suggesting that John Paul II and you were becoming revolutionary theologians as Texans would over against an evil regime.
The revolutionary aspect is in speaking of human beings as piasts or as kings. And to speak of human beings that way really and not merely metaphorically. I do believe that's revolutionary, and it has to be undertaken before we start talking about the state. Because if the first note of protest against modern political authority, which makes everyone sovereigns who reign but do not rule, which is to suck regalitas, not out of every person, but even out of government itself. Reigning without ruling is the central notion of the modern state, and I agree with your application to Rawls that it's the opposite of the Munus Regale. Now, if we try to mount a revolution in terms of looking at things completely in the opposite way, by starting with the state, we would get in trouble for this reason. If people don't understand themselves as being piasts or kings, that's where the revolution has to begin. Were people to think of themselves that way again, we wouldn't have
one
the modern
avenue
state.
to it which might be reclaimed by the Western Church, is the marriage ceremony, which was used in the West till at least the 8th century,
Right.
where we in the church crown the husband and wife as the king and queen of creation. And it's a way of doing
Exactly.
marriage that fell out in the West about the time of Nicholas I. But it's to recognize that the true king and queen of the husband and wife restored as Adam and Eve. And that teaching about marriage in the church is to understand that they are the king and they are the queen.
I understand that that's exactly what JP2 was trying to point out in the conferences on the body and in other encyclicals. It's a beautiful marriage ritual in the Byzantine church. But perhaps you could tell us how many people who are married in the Eastern church understand what it means anymore.
I think they understand what you ought to see sometime as them sitting up on thrones before the altar. If you don't understand you've been made a king or queen under those circumstances, I think you'd be hard to miss it. The Copts do it much more flamboyantly than we, because they sit up on the bema, crowned as king and queen. Hey, they know it, but they also have a regime they know is not Christian.
I might
So
say
they live
this,
in a
that one of the,
Constantinian.
not speaking of the Eastern churches, but the problem of the Western church, or churches, is that Vatican Council II was wrongly interpreted, in my view, to understand the laity as being unleashed to be citizens. That is, Catholicism is finally coming around to say the Republicans of 19th century France were right. You see, that we're all now citizens. The language, if carefully read, is not saying that. It doesn't say you can't be a citizen. It's saying something much more profound and revolutionary. We're kings. Exactly what the Third Republic in France would have found as treasonous to even say. And that this is why John Paul II, in his social doctrine, is, well, he's reading the signs of the times differently. Yes.
Was there a last question? It's going to be a good question. It's going to be a short question. It's
Short
going to be
answer.
A brief answer.
It's probably a fairly simple question. I'm afraid I don't know Latin, but it's threefold. First, am I right in understanding the meaning of munus as closer to duty than right? And then, in the documents that you referred to, is munus translated as mission? And then, what is the difference between missio and munus?
Good questions. Starting with the last, sometimes it is translated as being the equivalent of missio. But the term mission and vocation, those two words, are usually used with an even more explicit theological context. But you will notice when you go through the work of John Paul II and Vatican Council, and going back to Pius XI, those words, mission, vocation, munus, are all in the near vicinity of each other, usually in the same sentence. So you're absolutely right to see that connection. And your first question, like a duty. Now, it means a gift. But a freely given gift of service. So the obligation of the son in the Roman family, what is the priest? Because every Roman pater is a priest in the old days, old Rome. What's his primary obligation as father? To feed the dead. Libation too. Throw down canaries, food, wine, bread, and so forth. To feed the dead. It's called a munus because, yes, it's an obligation, but it's also a freely enacted service of the dead. And that's how the term gets applied to the gladiatorial contest, is that when the gladiators fight and the blood is spilt, it revivifies the dead under the ground. And it's called a munus. So it always carries the notion of an obligation, but also, it's not the same as the word debitum, something that I owe to someone else. It's a freely offered service, almost always with religious connotations. And this is why St. Jerome picked it out. And he must have known what he was doing, that the word munus, how deeply embedded it was in pagan religion. He picked it out and used it for the translation over and over again of Jewish priestly rituals in Pentateuch, in Leviticus, and so on and so forth. I mean, he knew what he was employing there. And the term had theological development to it. But I think almost out of the blue, Pius XI in the 1920s latches on to the idea, hey, this is good, not just for ecclesiology. This works to understand the foundation and the function of rites, of what we're trying to teach to Catholics who are in these modern states.
Thank you very much.